What if our search for God is not really about faith, not about truth, not about the divine? What if it begins somewhere closer, somewhere quieter, somewhere we rarely look? What if the question itself makes us uncomfortable? Most of us never stop to ask it, not because it is dangerous, but because it is intimate. We grow up learning how to look outward, toward ideas, toward beliefs, toward meanings that feel larger than us. And when life is smooth, we rarely question why. But when life tightens, when the noise inside becomes harder to ignore, that search takes on a different tone. It becomes urgent, it becomes emotional, it becomes personal. We say we are seeking God, but what does that really mean? Is it a longing for truth or a longing for relief? Is it devotion or exhaustion? Is it love or fear dressed as faith? These are not accusations, they are human questions, because before belief becomes theology, it begins as experience. A moment of confusion, a moment of pain, a moment where something inside feels too heavy to carry alone. And in those moments, looking outward feels safer than looking inward. Looking upward feels cleaner than sitting with what we feel. Silence can be uncomfortable, not because it is empty, but because it is honest. In silence, there is no language to hide behind, no explanation to lean on, no belief system to organize the chaos. There is just experience, breath, thought, feeling. And for many of us, that is the hardest place to remain. So we move, we search, we reach, we read sacred words, we repeat prayers, we listen for guidance. Not because these things are false, but because they offer structure when our inner world feels unstructured. They give shape to what feels overwhelming. They give meaning to what feels random. They give comfort to what feels raw. And comfort is not wrong, but comfort can also distract. It can soften pain without ever touching its source. It can calm the surface while the depth remains untouched. So the question quietly waits. Are we seeking God because we are drawn to truth, or because truth, as it is, feels too close, too exposed, too demanding? To look inward requires staying present with uncertainty, with fear that has no clear name, with loneliness that has no obvious cause, with restlessness that belief alone does not dissolve. And many of us were never taught how to stay there. We were taught how to resolve, how to explain, how to believe, not how to sit, not how to listen without trying to fix, not how to remain without reaching for answers. So when the inner weight builds, the outer search begins. We call it faith, we call it spirituality, we call it seeking God. And sometimes it truly is. But sometimes it is something quieter, a subtle movement away from discomfort, a gentle turning away from questions we are not ready to face. This does not make belief false, and it does not make doubt superior. It simply reveals something honest about being human. We want relief. We want reassurance. We want to feel held when life feels unstable. And so we look for something that feels solid, something eternal, something unchanging, something that does not tremble the way we do. But the question remains, if God is sought only when we are overwhelmed, what are we really responding to? The divine or distress? And if belief disappears the moment peace returns, what was it truly addressing? Truth or tension? These questions are uncomfortable because they remove the safety of easy answers. They do not attack belief. They expose motivation. They ask us to look not at what we believe, but why we believe. And that requires honesty without judgment. It requires slowing down without conclusions. It requires staying with a question without demanding resolution. This is not how we are used to engaging spirituality. We prefer clarity. We prefer certainty. We prefer direction. But clarity often arrives only after patience, and patience begins with staying present to what is. Not what we hope for, not what we are told, but what we actually experience. Thoughts that loop, emotions that rise and fall, a sense of lack that belief alone does not always fill. And here is where the question deepens. If the discomfort we are avoiding is part of being human, what happens when we finally stop running from it? What happens when we stop searching outward long enough to listen inward? Not to judge, not to analyze, but simply to notice. Notice fear without naming it evil. Notice doubt without calling it failure. Notice longing without immediately spiritualizing it. Just notice. For many, this feels more threatening than disbelief, because belief offers identity, community, structure, while inward attention offers nothing but presence. No promises, no guarantees, just experience as it unfolds. And yet many traditions quietly point here. Not loudly, not dogmatically, but softly. They speak of stillness, of silence, of awareness, not as concepts, but as lived realities. But even these teachings are often turned into ideas before they are experienced. We talk about presence without being present. We discuss silence without ever sitting in it. We speak of God without noticing the one who is speaking. And so the search continues. Faster, broader, more complex. Until one day the question returns, not as philosophy, not as theology, but as a feeling. A quiet sense that something essential has been bypassed, that in all our searching we may have missed what was already here. This video does not ask you to abandon faith. It does not ask you to reject God. It asks something simpler, to pause, to notice, to consider whether seeking outward has sometimes been easier than staying inward, and whether the God we are searching for might be encountered only after we stop running from ourselves. There is no conclusion here, no instruction, no resolution, only a question that deserves space and patience and honesty. So we move gently forward. When life becomes too heavy, it rarely announces itself clearly. It doesn't always arrive as tragedy. Sometimes it comes as exhaustion, as confusion, as a quiet sense that something is no longer working. You wake up and feel behind before the day begins. Your thoughts move faster than your body. Your responsibilities feel heavier than your capacity. Nothing is technically wrong, yet everything feels difficult. This is often how heaviness begins, not dramatic, not obvious, just persistent. And when that weight stays long enough, something instinctive happens. We look for something to hold on to. This response is older than language, older than culture, older than belief systems. When the ground feels unstable, humans search for ground. When life feels out of control, we look for something that seems greater than us, something steady, something that does not shake when we do. This is not philosophy, it is survival. A child reaches for a parent. An exhausted mind reaches for certainty. A suffering heart reaches for meaning. And often that reaching takes the shape of belief. Belief does not always begin as doctrine. It begins as relief, a sense that someone sees us, that something holds us, that our pain is not meaningless. In moments like these, belief becomes a refuge, not because it explains everything, but because it softens what hurts. Prayer becomes a place to rest, not necessarily a conversation. Sometimes just a pause, a moment where the weight is set down, where the mind stops trying to solve itself, where the heart feels less alone. This is a shared human movement, across religions, across centuries, across cultures that never met. People look upward when life presses downward. They speak words into silence. They trust something unseen. They surrender control when control feels impossible. This does not come from ignorance. It comes from vulnerability. When effort no longer works, we stop trying to hold everything ourselves. And that surrender can feel like peace. For a moment, the struggle loosens, the breath deepens, the mind slows. There is comfort in believing that someone or something is carrying what we cannot, and that comfort matters. Pain does not ask philosophical questions, it asks for relief. Confusion does not demand truth, it demands stability, and belief often provides that. Not as an answer, but as a shelter. But heaviness is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. A sense of emptiness after success. A quiet dissatisfaction that appears without reason. A feeling of being disconnected even when surrounded by people. These moments are harder to explain and harder to soothe because there is nothing obvious to fix. Yet the weight is still there. And again, the search begins. We look for meaning, for direction, for something larger that can explain what we feel. We tell ourselves this feeling must have a purpose, that it must be pointing somewhere. And sometimes that belief helps us continue. It gives shape to uncertainty. It gives language to confusion. It gives hope to what feels hollow. But heaviness has a way of returning. Because belief can soothe pain without touching its source. It can calm the surface while something deeper remains unresolved. This is not a criticism. It is an observation. Belief is often used the way rest is used, as a pause, as a break, not as a solution. And sometimes a pause is exactly what is needed. A person who has been drowning does not need a lecture on swimming. They need air. Belief can be that air. It can keep us afloat when we do not yet know how to move. But heaviness is patient. It waits. And if what we are resting from is not examined, it slowly returns. Not stronger, just familiar. This is where confusion often grows. We believe, we pray, We feel better. Then later the weight returns, and we believe again. We pray again, and the cycle continues. This is not hypocrisy, it is humanity. We return to what brings relief because relief matters, but relief alone does not always bring understanding. And heaviness often asks to be understood, not explained away, not justified, but felt. There is something deeply human about wanting to be held rather than to understand. When life overwhelms us, analysis feels cruel. Presence feels kind. So we choose presence in the form we know: belief, prayer, surrender. These are not escapes by default. They are responses, natural, understandable, shared. But sometimes the weight we are carrying is not external. It is not caused by events or circumstances or loss. Sometimes it comes from inside, from unspoken fear, from unresolved grief, from questions we have never allowed ourselves to ask. And belief, when used only as refuge, may gently cover those questions without ever meeting them. Again, this is not judgment. Most of us were never taught how to sit with discomfort. We were taught how to manage, how to cope, how to move forward, not how to remain. So when life becomes heavy, remaining feels dangerous, stillness feels threatening, because stillness allows everything to surface: the thoughts we avoid, the emotions we postpone, the questions we distract ourselves from. And belief can protect us from that flood. It gives us something to lean on so we do not collapse inward. This is why belief becomes refuge, not as an idea but as an experience of safety. And prayer becomes rest because rest is rare when the mind is overwhelmed. To sit quietly without direction can feel unbearable, so we give the mind a direction, upward, outward, towards something that feels solid. This movement is not wrong. It is compassionate, but it may not be complete, because heaviness does not always ask to be lifted. Sometimes it asks to be listened to, and listening requires space, not answers, not solutions, just attention. But attention is difficult when pain is present, so we seek comfort first, and comfort has many forms. For some it is belief, for others it is distraction, for others it is productivity. The form changes, the impulse is the same: to escape the weight, to feel okay again, and that impulse is deeply human. So when life becomes too heavy, we do what humans have always done. We reach, we hold on, we rest where we can, and sometimes that rest is necessary. Without it, we would break. But somewhere beneath the comfort, a quieter process begins, a question forming beneath the relief. Not about belief, not about prayer, but about motivation. About whether we are reaching outward because something within feels unbearable, not to judge, not to criticize, just to notice. And that noticing is where the next question waits. But beneath that search, beneath the prayers, beneath the beliefs we return to again and again, there is a quieter question waiting. One that does not demand an answer, one that does not accuse, one that simply asks, are we truly seeking God? Or are we escaping fear, guilt, loneliness, and uncertainty? This question is uncomfortable, not because it is radical, but because it is close. It does not challenge what we believe. It gently turns our attention toward why we believe. And for many of us, that feels far more threatening, because belief often carries identity, history, family, community. While motivation carries vulnerability, it asks us to look not at sacred texts or teachings, but at our own inner movements, to notice what is happening inside us at the moment we begin to seek. Do we seek when we are calm, or when we are overwhelmed? Do we reach for God when life feels open and spacious, or when it feels tight and unbearable? This is not to say that seeking in pain is wrong. Pain has always been a doorway to depth, but pain can also become a doorway to avoidance. Fear is often the first thing we meet. Fear of losing control, fear of not being enough, fear of being alone with our thoughts. Fear has no clear shape. It hides behind busyness, behind belief, behind certainty. When fear arises, the mind looks for something solid, something certain, something absolute, and belief can provide that. It can give fear a name, a direction, a place to go. Instead of sitting with fear, we rise above it. Instead of feeling it fully, we explain it spiritually. This does not make belief false. It reveals how fear operates. Fear does not want to be felt. It wants to be resolved. And belief often promises resolution. Guilt works differently, but with the same intensity. Guilt is not just about actions. It is about identity, a quiet sense that something is wrong with us, that we have failed, that we are lacking. Guilt does not ask to be understood. It asks to be removed. And belief can offer cleansing. forgiveness, redemption. These are powerful experiences. They can bring real relief, real transformation, but they can also bypass the deeper work of understanding where guilt came from, what expectations shaped it, what stories fed it, what parts of ourselves we learned to reject. Instead of meeting guilt directly, we rise above it. Instead of listening to it, we hand it over. Again, this is not wrong. It is human. Loneliness moves more quietly. It does not announce itself as pain. It appears as distance, a feeling of being unseen, unmet, disconnected. Loneliness is especially difficult in a world full of people because it feels unjustified, so we rarely name it. Instead, we look for connection elsewhere. We look for something that sees us completely, that knows us fully, that never leaves. God becomes that presence, not as doctrine, but as companionship. Prayer becomes conversation, not with others, but with something that listens without interruption. And that can be deeply healing. But it can also quietly replace the work of noticing how we relate to ourselves, whether we allow ourselves to be seen by ourselves, whether we can stay present with the feeling of being alone without rushing to fill it. Uncertainty is perhaps the most difficult to face, because it offers no emotion to resolve, only not knowing. Uncertainty dissolves plans, destabilizes identity, removes ground. And the mind resists this more than anything. So it looks for answers, for frameworks, for meaning systems that promise coherence. Belief can provide that. It can tell us there is a plan, a purpose, a reason, and that can be comforting. But uncertainty is not always a problem to be solved. Sometimes it is a condition to be endured. Sometimes it is the space where honesty begins. But uncertainty feels intolerable when we are not used to being present. So we move away from it. We move toward belief, toward certainty, toward answers. And again, this does not make belief invalid. It reveals what uncertainty asks of us: to remain without resolution, to stay open without explanation, to live without guarantees. And most of us were never taught how to do that. So we seek, and in seeking we often feel relief. The fear softens, the guilt eases, the loneliness feels held, the uncertainty feels framed, and we call this seeking God. And sometimes that is exactly what it is. But sometimes it is something else. A subtle turning away from inner experience, a gentle refusal to stay with what is uncomfortable, not out of dishonesty, out of self-protection. Because sitting with fear without escaping it can feel overwhelming. Because meeting guilt without resolving it can feel unbearable. Because allowing loneliness without filling it can feel endless. Because staying with uncertainty without answers can feel like falling. So we do what humans have always done. We reach for what steadies us. We reach for what comforts us. We reach for what promises meaning. And often that reaching is sincere. But sincerity does not guarantee awareness. It is possible to be deeply sincere and still be avoiding something. Not intentionally, not consciously, quietly, automatically. Because avoidance does not always feel like running. Sometimes it feels like devotion. It feels noble, purposeful, meaningful. And that is why this question is so uncomfortable. Because it does not accuse belief, it questions movement. It asks us to slow down and notice what happens inside us right before we seek. Do we feel tight, contracted, afraid? Do we feel empty, ashamed, uncertain? And if so, what would happen if we stayed with that feeling just a moment longer? Not to analyze it, not to fix it, not to spiritualize it, just to feel it. Most of us never try. Not because we are unwilling, but because we are untrained. We were taught how to think, how to believe, how to perform meaning, not how to remain present with discomfort. So when discomfort arises, we move, upward, outward, away, and belief gives us permission to do so without guilt. It gives us a reason that feels elevated, but elevation is not the same as integration. And integration is what discomfort often asks for: to be seen, to be felt, to be understood, not as a problem, but as information. This is where the question pauses, not to answer itself, not to conclude, just to remain. Are we seeking God, or are we escaping guilt, loneliness, and uncertainty? Perhaps sometimes we are doing both. Perhaps the line is not as clear as we would like, and perhaps that is the point. Not to separate belief from avoidance, but to become aware of when one is replacing the other. Because awareness changes everything. Not belief, not doubt. Awareness. The ability to notice what is happening inside us as it happens, without judgment, without correction, just noticing. And noticing requires stillness. Stillness we often avoid because stillness brings us closer to ourselves, and being close to ourselves can be the most uncomfortable place of all. So we stop here, not with an answer, not with a solution, just with the question resting quietly. Some traditions teach that God is beyond us, above us, outside the boundaries of the self, waiting to be found. God as creator, God as guide, God as a presence greater than the human mind can contain. In these traditions, the journey moves outward, through prayer, through devotion, through obedience and trust. The seeker looks up, looks forward, looks beyond the limits of personal experience. There is comfort in this direction, because it suggests that meaning does not depend on us, that truth exists whether we understand it or not, that something steady remains even when we feel unstable. To believe that God is beyond us is to believe that we are not alone in carrying the weight of existence. And for many, this belief has carried them through suffering, through loss, through moments when human strength was not enough. But there is another path, quieter, less visible, often misunderstood. This path suggests that truth is not far away, not hidden in the sky, not waiting at the end of effort. It suggests that truth is closer than we think, already present, already within. Here the journey does not move outward, it turns inward, toward awareness, toward attention, toward direct experience, not toward a God to be found, but toward a reality to be noticed. In this view, what we are seeking is not separate from the seeker. Truth is not something we reach. It is something we stop overlooking. This path often speaks the language of silence, of stillness, of observation without judgment. It invites us not to believe more, but to notice more. Not to reach upward, but to settle inward, to sit, to breathe, to remain. At first glance, these two paths appear very different. One looks outward to the divine, the other looks inward to awareness. One speaks of surrender to something greater. The other speaks of seeing clearly what is already here. One emphasizes faith, the other emphasizes presence. And yet beneath these differences, there is a shared human struggle. A struggle that neither path escapes. The difficulty of being alone with ourselves in silence. Silence without prayer. Silence without explanation. Silence without distraction. Silence where nothing is required and nothing is promised. This is where both paths quietly meet. Because whether we look outward or inward, we eventually encounter the same resistance. The mind resists stillness. The heart resists exposure. The self resists being seen without structure. In outward traditions, silence is often filled with words, with hymns, with guidance. Silence becomes something directed, and this direction can feel safer, because silence without guidance can feel like falling. In inward traditions, silence is left open. No instructions, no answers, no authority, just awareness meeting experience. And this openness can feel even more threatening, because there is nothing to lean on, nothing to hold on to, nothing to believe in, just what is. And what is often uncomfortable. Thoughts arise without invitation, memories surface without warning, emotions move without explanation, fear, restlessness, doubt. These do not disappear just because we choose a path. They appear precisely when we slow down. So whether one kneels in prayer or sits in meditation, the same challenge emerges. Can I remain here without escaping? Can I stay present without needing to change what I feel? Can I be with myself without immediately seeking relief? This is the struggle both paths touch, not the question of where God is, but the question of where we go when nothing is happening, when there is no crisis to respond to, no prayer to recite, no insight to pursue, just time, just awareness, just being. For many people, this is the most difficult moment, because silence reveals, not truth in the abstract, but truth in experience. It reveals how restless the mind is, how fragile identity feels, how quickly discomfort arises when nothing distracts us. This is why silence is often avoided, not consciously, automatically. We fill it with noise, with belief, with activity, even spiritual activity. And this is where the two paths are often misunderstood as opposites. One path says, trust something beyond you. The other says, look deeply into what you are. But both require the same courage. The courage to remain, to not flee from silence, to not rush toward answers, to let experience unfold without controlling it. And most of us struggle here, because being alone with ourselves means meeting parts we would rather not see, uncertainty without resolution, fear without a clear cause, loneliness without a story. And neither outward belief nor inward awareness automatically removes these. They only bring us closer to what is actually happening. This is why many people move between paths. When inward silence feels too raw, they turn outward for comfort. When outward belief feels too distant, they turn inward for authenticity. This movement is not confusion. It is honesty. It reflects a deep human need to feel safe while seeking truth. But safety and truth do not always arrive together. Sometimes truth unsettles us before it grounds us. Sometimes safety delays what truth is asking us to see. And so the struggle continues. Not between religions, not between philosophies, but within the human experience itself. The struggle to remain present without escaping. The struggle to stay honest without collapsing. The struggle to be still without needing to be saved. This struggle does not belong to any tradition. It belongs to being human, and this is why no path is free from difficulty. Outward paths can become dependency. Inward paths can become isolation. One can avoid responsibility by surrendering everything to God. The other can avoid vulnerability by hiding behind awareness. Both can become strategies rather than encounters. Strategies to manage discomfort, to organize experience, to make life feel coherent. But coherence is not the same as truth. And comfort is not the same as presence. This is not to say that either path is false. They have guided millions, they have offered meaning, ethics, compassion, but neither path eliminates the core human challenge. To be alone with oneself without running, without numbing, without explaining, just being. This is where silence becomes important, not as a technique, not as a practice, but as a mirror. Silence shows us what we habitually avoid. It shows us how quickly we reach for something else, God, meaning, insight, anything but the raw moment. And perhaps this is why silence is so central to both paths. Prayer often begins in silence. Meditation rests in silence, different forms, same doorway, and yet few stay long enough to see what silence reveals. Because silence does not reward us quickly, it does not comfort immediately, it does not explain itself, it simply stays. And staying is what we find difficult. So we move, between paths, between beliefs, between practices, hoping one of them will finally remove the discomfort of being ourselves. But what if that discomfort is not a mistake? What if it is the meeting point both paths are pointing toward, not God beyond us, not truth within us, but the courage to remain present without escaping, to sit in silence without needing it to become something else? This is not a conclusion, it is an observation, a recognition that the struggle is not about direction, it is about presence, and presence is demanding, because it asks us to be here as we are, without guarantees. So the two paths remain, different in language, different in form, but touching the same human place, the place where silence begins and where avoidance becomes visible. And from here another question quietly follows. Not about God, not about truth, but about what happens when seeking itself becomes another way to move away from ourselves. Sometimes belief comforts us. It steadies the breath, it softens the mind, it gives shape to moments that feel too loose, too uncertain, too raw. And sometimes belief does something else. It distracts us, not loudly, not obviously, but gently, quietly, in ways that are easy to miss, not from evil, not from danger, not from something external, but from ourselves. This is difficult to notice because distraction does not always feel like avoidance. Often it feels like meaning, like devotion, like commitment. It feels purposeful, respectable, even admirable. We read sacred words, we listen to teachings, we repeat prayers, we engage in rituals, and all of this can be sincere, it can be heartfelt, it can be real. But sincerity does not always mean awareness. Sometimes the mind uses even the most sacred things to keep itself busy. Because being busy is easier than being still. Being busy gives us direction. Stillness gives us nowhere to go. And nowhere to go means we must stay. Stay with thoughts that do not resolve. Stay with emotions that do not explain themselves. Stay with a sense of self that feels incomplete. This is uncomfortable. So the mind reaches for what feels elevated. Belief becomes a place to stand above the messiness of inner experience. It gives us language when words fail. It gives us certainty when doubt feels unbearable. It gives us identity when the sense of self feels unstable. And again, this is not wrong. It is human. When something inside feels too close, too exposed, too uncertain, we instinctively look for distance. Distance does not always mean running away. Sometimes it means rising above, and belief can offer that elevation. We tell ourselves that what we feel is part of a bigger plan, that our pain has meaning, that our confusion will be resolved. These thoughts can bring relief, they can calm the nervous system, they can restore hope, they can keep us going. But relief is not the same as presence, and hope is not the same as honesty. Sometimes belief does not meet our experience, it moves us away from it, gently, lovingly, but still away. Consider how often seeking begins when something inside feels wrong. A feeling of restlessness, a quiet dissatisfaction, a sense of not being at ease with oneself. Instead of staying with that feeling, we search. We search for answers, for teachings, for explanations that make sense of the discomfort. And in that search, the discomfort is postponed, not resolved, just postponed. We feel better, calmer, more grounded, and that feels like progress. But what if the discomfort was not asking to be fixed? What if it was asking to be felt? This is where seeking can quietly become escaping, not because the seeking is false, but because the motivation is unexamined. The mind does not ask, what am I running from? It asks, what can I hold on to? And belief offers something to hold. It gives structure to the inner world. It organizes experience. It tells us where we stand and who we are. An identity feels safer than openness, because openness has no boundaries. It does not tell us who we are. It only shows us what is happening. And what is happening is often unfinished, unclear, uncomfortable. So the mind chooses structure, it chooses meaning. It chooses narratives that place discomfort within a larger story. And again, this can be helpful, but it can also become a habit of moving away from direct experience, a habit of translating feeling into belief. Instead of staying with fear, we label it as a test. Instead of staying with guilt, we label it as sin. Instead of staying with loneliness, we label it as separation from God. These labels are not inherently wrong, but they are interpretations. And interpretation creates distance. It creates space between us and what we feel. Sometimes that space is necessary, sometimes it prevents overwhelm, but sometimes it prevents intimacy. Intimacy with our own inner life. Because to feel something directly without naming it, without explaining it, without justifying it, is deeply challenging. The mind resists this. It wants to understand, to categorize, to resolve. Belief gives it a way to do that. But when belief becomes the first response rather than the last, something subtle happens. We no longer ask, what am I feeling? We ask, what does this mean? And meaning moves us away from sensation. It moves us away from the rawness of experience. It allows us to stay above the surface, safe, composed, spiritually articulate. But the surface is not where life is lived. Life is lived in sensation, in emotion, in the body. And these do not always align with belief. Sometimes, belief says peace while the body feels tense. Belief says trust while the heart feels afraid. Belief says surrender while the mind resists. When this happens, we often correct the body. We tell ourselves we should feel differently. We pray more. We believe harder. And in doing so, we move further away from what is actually happening. Not because belief demands this, but because we use belief this way, as a tool to override discomfort, as a way to avoid listening. This is not unique to religion. People do the same with positivity, with productivity, with distraction. Religion is simply a refined version of the same impulse. The impulse to not feel what feels too much, to not stay where we feel exposed. So seeking becomes movement. Movement away from inattention, movement towards something that feels stable. And stability matters. But if stability is always found outside, what happens to our capacity to remain inside? To stay with fear without needing it to disappear, to stay with guilt without resolving it immediately, to stay with loneliness without filling it, to stay with uncertainty without answers. These capacities are not taught. They are developed only through staying. And staying is uncomfortable. So we seek, and seeking feels active, meaningful, even courageous, while staying feels passive, vulnerable, exposed. But staying is where intimacy grows, intimacy with oneself. And without that intimacy, belief can remain abstract, beautiful, inspiring, but distant. This is why some people feel spiritually active, yet internally disconnected. They know the language of belief, they understand the teachings, they follow the practices, but they do not feel at home within themselves. Because home requires presence, and presence cannot be substituted by meaning. This is where seeking becomes escaping. Not as a failure, not as a moral flaw, but as a natural tendency. The mind prefers movement to stillness, explanation to sensation, certainty to openness. So it seeks, and sometimes it seeks endlessly, one teaching after another, one insight after another, one experience after another, always moving forward, rarely settling, because settling means stopping, and stopping means facing what movement was avoiding. This does not mean seeking should stop, it means seeking should be noticed, not judged, not condemned, just noticed. What happens inside me when I begin to seek? What am I feeling right before I turn outward? Is it curiosity or is it discomfort? Is it openness or is it tension? Is it love or is it fear? There is no correct answer, only honesty. And honesty changes the nature of seeking. When seeking is honest, it does not run. It does not distract. It includes staying with what hurts, staying with what confuses, staying with what feels incomplete. Belief then becomes support, not substitution. It accompanies experience rather than replacing it. But this balance is delicate because it requires awareness, and awareness slows us down. It removes the comfort of automatic movement. It asks us to pause before reaching, and pausing can feel unsettling because it exposes our habits of escape, not dramatic escapes, quiet ones. Scrolling, thinking, believing, all ways of moving away from direct contact with ourselves. So when seeking becomes escaping, it does not announce itself. It feels spiritual, responsible, meaningful, and that is why it is difficult to see. But seeing does not require accusation, only attention. Attention to the subtle shift from presence to avoidance, from listening to explaining, from staying to reaching. This is not a conclusion. It is an invitation to notice, to gently ask, what is happening here? Not to stop believing, not to stop seeking, but to include ourselves in the process, to not leave ourselves behind in the search for something higher. Because perhaps what we are escaping is not something dark or wrong. Perhaps it is simply our own unfinished experience. And perhaps the most difficult thing is not the fear or the guilt or the loneliness, but staying close enough to feel them without turning away. So we pause here, not to decide, not to resolve, just to notice the thin line between comfort and distraction, between seeking and escaping. And from this pause, another question quietly emerges, not about belief, not about truth, but about what happens when we stop running. So the question remains, not louder than before, not sharper, just quieter. Are we seeking God, or are we still running from the silence within? This question does not arrive to be solved, it arrives to stay, because some questions are not meant to move us forward, they are meant to slow us down. Throughout this reflection, nothing has been asked of you, no belief to adopt, no position to defend, no conclusion to reach, only attention. Attention to movement, to motivation, to the subtle ways we relate to our own inner life. Because running does not always look like running. Sometimes it looks like searching, sometimes it looks like devotion, sometimes it looks like improvement, and sometimes it looks like spirituality. Running from silence does not mean rejecting stillness. It means never staying long enough for stillness to speak. Silence is often misunderstood. It is not empty. It is not peaceful by default. It does not immediately calm us. Silence is revealing. It shows us how restless the mind is, how quickly we want something to happen, how uncomfortable we are without direction. When nothing is asked of us, we often feel uneasy, because without roles to perform, without ideas to hold, without beliefs to lean on, we meet ourselves more directly, and that meeting can feel exposed. This is why silence is often avoided, not consciously, but instinctively. We fill it with sound, with thought, with prayer, with seeking. And again, none of these are wrong. They are responses, human responses to the discomfort of being present. So when we ask whether we are seeking God or running from silence, we are not being asked to choose. We are being asked to notice. Notice when seeking feels open, and notice when it feels urgent. Notice when belief feels expansive, and notice when it feels protective. Notice when prayer feels like presence, and notice when it feels like escape. These distinctions are subtle. They cannot be reduced to rules. They can only be sensed. And sensing requires slowness, because the moment we rush, we miss what is actually happening. This is why there is no answer here, because answers close questions, and this question needs space. If we answer too quickly, we turn it into a position. If we decide, we stop listening. But listening is what this question asks for. Listening not to words, but to experience. What happens in the body when we stop seeking? What happens in the mind when there is nothing to grasp? What happens in the heart when silence is allowed to remain? Some people fear that without seeking, life will lose meaning. But meaning does not disappear in silence. It simply stops explaining itself. Some fear that without belief, there will be nothing to hold on to. But silence does not remove support. It removes distraction. What remains may feel unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean wrong. Others fear that silence will expose something unbearable, and sometimes it does expose pain, old grief, unspoken fear, unresolved longing. But exposure is not destruction. It is contact, and contact is often the beginning of honesty, not the honesty of ideas, but the honesty of feeling. And feeling does not require interpretation. It only requires presence. This is where the idea of God often becomes complicated. Because for some, God represents meaning, safety, love. For others, God represents authority, judgment, distance. And for many, God represents comfort from uncertainty. But what if God, whatever that word points to, is not found through movement? What if God is not at the end of seeking, but at the beginning of stillness? Not as a concept, not as an answer, but as presence. Not presence as belief, but presence as experience. This does not negate faith. It does not deny tradition. It simply asks whether our relationship to the sacred includes stillness, whether we allow ourselves to be present without needing something to happen. Because presence is the one thing seeking cannot produce. It can only reveal it when seeking stops. But stopping feels counterintuitive. We are taught to move forward, to grow, to search. We are not taught to remain. So when silence appears, we fill it. When nothing happens, we create meaning. When uncertainty arises, we seek answers. And again, this is human. But humanity also has another capacity, the capacity to stay, to sit without direction, to breathe without purpose, to notice without correcting. This capacity is rarely used, not because it is unimportant, but because it is subtle. It does not reward us quickly. It does not affirm identity. It does not promise outcomes. It simply allows reality to be what it is. And what it is can feel unsatisfying at first. Because we are used to stimulation, to progress, to reassurance. Silence offers none of that. It offers only contact. Contact with thought, contact with feeling, contact with awareness itself. And awareness does not explain itself. It does not tell us who we are or what we should believe. It simply reveals what is happening. This is why silence feels threatening. Not because it takes something away, but because it removes our usual strategies. And without strategies, we feel exposed. So the question remains, are we seeking God, or are we running from silence? And perhaps the most honest answer is that sometimes we are doing both. Sometimes seeking is genuine openness. Sometimes it is protection. Sometimes prayer is presence. Sometimes it is avoidance. Sometimes belief expands us. Sometimes it shields us. And this does not make us inconsistent. It makes us human. The problem is not that we seek. The problem is that we seek automatically, without noticing why, without noticing what we feel just before we reach, without noticing what we leave behind when we move outward. And what we often leave behind is ourselves. Our immediate experience, our unfiltered emotions, our raw uncertainty. Silence brings us back to these, not to punish us, but to include us. To include the parts of us that seeking sometimes overlooks, the parts that are afraid, the parts that are tired, the parts that are unsure. These parts do not need answers. They need presence, and presence cannot be outsourced. It cannot be believed into existence. It cannot be searched for. It can only be allowed by staying, by not turning away the moment discomfort appears, by not rushing to interpret, by not rushing to escape. This does not mean we must abandon seeking. It means we include stillness within seeking. We allow silence to be part of the path, not as a practice, not as a technique, but as a willingness to be here without agenda. And this willingness changes everything. Because when we are willing to stay, seeking becomes softer, less urgent, less desperate. It becomes curiosity rather than escape. It becomes exploration rather than avoidance. Belief becomes companion rather than shield. Prayer becomes listening rather than asking. And silence becomes not something to flee, but something to trust. Not because it is peaceful, but because it is honest. So the question remains, not as a demand, not as a test, but as an invitation. Are we seeking God, or are we still running from the silence within? You do not need to answer, you only need to notice. Notice when you feel the urge to move away from stillness. Notice when seeking accelerates instead of deepens. Notice when belief comforts and when it distracts. This noticing is enough, because awareness does not require conclusions. It only requires presence, and presence is already here when we stop running. So we end without ending, without answers, without certainty, only with space. Space for silence, space for honesty, space for whatever arises when nothing is demanded. And perhaps in that space, something quieter than belief and deeper than seeking can finally be felt. Not as God found, not as truth discovered, but as the simple experience of being here with nothing to escape and nothing to prove.